taking care of the people impacted by war. That's reflected in what's called, the Geneva Convention's Geneva Law, focusing on the care and treatment of people impacted by war. The other one is sometimes referred to as Hague Law, which is older than Geneva Law, and it's all about how can war lawfully be fought, how should it be limited. But there's a recognition there that nation states are going to engage in war, and so if they're going to do that, they have to follow certain rules. So it's Hague and Geneva, and I think IHL kind of indicates to people that maybe they're kind of forgetting about Hague, and the whole fact that there is a concept of military necessity that actually permits warfare in a lawful sense. When I teach law of armed conflict to students, I sometimes have two groups of students in it. One are a lot of times veterans who've actually been in combat. And then there's kind of what I call internationalist students who want to ban war. And so it's kind of interesting. You're dealing with these two groups that have different perspectives. And I like to tell them both perspectives are actually reflected in the law of armed conflict. Although one of the hardest things about it is an international body of law that actually, in certain circumstances, permits war. So I want to start with this. What is this? Which submarine? That's the Cobia. Yeah. Wonderful ship. I spent 3 nights on it, not in a row. 3 different Cub Scout trips. But why do I have the Cobia here, other than the fact that it's a beautiful ship and it's right over there? It's just kind of an aid to talk about what's a lawful thing to use in war, right? Now, submarines, we've all grown up with submarine movies, and they're a big part of World War II movies. And but there was a time when submarines were new, and submarines were viewed as being sneaky and surreptitious, and especially like in the Royal Navy, there are a lot of people who say no gentleman would ever, engage in warfare with a submarine. Right? It's unsporting. At the Hague International Conference in 1899, the Tsar's representatives from the Russian Imperial government actually proposed that submarines be banned as an illegal weapon. Now, it didn't go anywhere, that proposal, but it was kind of an attempt to ban a new weapon. And sometimes new weapons are kind of looked at askance, and there's that instinct about, well, war's already bad enough, do we have to allow this new weapon, right? But sometimes particular weapons are banned. For instance, poison weapons, they're banned, as we're going to talk about. Gas is banned as a method in warfare. Landmines are illegal under a lot of circumstances. Cluster munitions can be illegal depending on how they're used. Some people want to ban landmines and cluster munitions altogether. And sometimes a certain practice is banned, misusing a flag of truce, for instance, or other kind of perfidious conduct. But so the Tsar's proposal went nowhere. But it crops up every now and then, this attempt to limit a weapon. And in 2012, I was at a conference in Berlin, and it was focusing on whether unmanned aerial vehicles, armed, should be banned. Because they were the latest thing. And they're like, wow, this is, there were a lot of people who thought they should be banned. Now, when you think about it, it's like, well, why logically would a UAV be banned? And the idea was, well, people are able to project power without even risking their pilots. Well, are missiles banned? No. And I was at the conference and I brought up the fact that, like, I use the submarine analogy. It's like, listen, subs weren't banned because you couldn't actually articulate why a particular type of warship can't be used, but the other warships, you could blast the heck out of each other using these other warships. So there is a certain logic to weapons and the use of weapons, and sometimes the response is more emotional and not logical. But at the same time, there is a practice the U.S. government does where we have a weapons review. A new weapon comes along, or a combination of weapons. The lawyers have to look at it to make sure it's lawful, or maybe it is lawful ostensibly, but it has to be lawful and used under certain circumstances. For instance, the first person who used a drone but attached a Hellfire missile to it, my understanding, just don't quote me, that was done before there was actually a weapons review on it. Now, it turns out there's no problem doing that as long as the targeting is correct. But still, the DoD tends to take that pretty seriously. You have to have weapons review. Just one last, literally a sea story with regard to weapons and warships. I won't deal too much with naval warfare today, unfortunately, but because it's great stuff. Some of it's a little archaic. But you've seen pictures of hospital ships, right? Painted white, big red cross on it. We have two. They're very large. They're very slow moving. You don't put a hospital ship with other combatant vessels because that'd violate the rules. They're supposed to be kept inviolate. You don't get to protect them and you don't want to endanger them by surrounding them with other combatant vessels that can be targeted. You don't have big guns on hospital ships. They're defenseless. They're supposed to be defenseless. They're floating hospitals. The law on hospital ships is clear. And then in the early part of this century, with terrorists using fast boats to attack a lot of merchant ships and other surface combatants, there were some proposals inside the Navy. It's like, we understand that the only weapons allowed on a hospital ship are maybe the sidearms that the doctors can wear to protect the patients if somehow they're boarded and people are attacking the patients, because that's allowed. Doctors don't engage in offensive military operations, but medical personnel can protect patients. So they have sidearms, but there's no what's called crew-served weapons on these ships. There's no 5-inch guns. And the proposal inside the Navy was, that doesn't make any sense. Yeah, they're legal right now, the way we do it, but what's going to stop a speedboat loaded with dynamite from ramming in to this very slow-moving, painted white thing with a big red target on the side? These things have an important function to take care of the sick and wounded, and not necessarily just in warfare. We send the hospital ships all over the place for disaster relief. And so the idea was, maybe the law of hospital ships should be adjusted. So there was some discussion about that, big pushback. But you can see why there was a discussion about it. It's like, maybe in furtherance of the whole idea of a hospital ship, we should do a slight change to protect them, given the nature of some eventualities that may be occurring. Didn't go anywhere ultimately, because that was too big a change. Letting crew-served weapons, 5-inch guns, whatever, what have you, on hospital ships is a big step. There weren't any outrages against hospital ships. There aren't that many around. I suppose if there were, by small boats, there might have actually been a change in the international hospital ships. But this is an example of the consideration of what's going on. Just like with these new things, the submarines. Are we going to really allow these? Right? So that's the little there's a little history lesson there, but here's something that's just brand new, okay? Friday, St. Patty's Day. So the International Criminal Court, the pretrial chamber, issued arrest warrants for our friend, Vlad, and Maria Lvova-Belova, great name, who is ironically Putin's Presidential Commissioner for Children's Rights. And so the allegation is that Russia has forcibly transferred thousands of Ukrainian children to areas it controls, assigning them Russian citizenship. Maria Lvova-Belova has talked about the brand new Russian citizens. Forcibly adopted them into Russian families, created obstacles for reunification with their parents, or to go back to the Ukraine. And international humanitarian law, or law of armed conflict, actually prohibits the evacuation of children by a party to the conflict, unless it's to keep them safe temporarily. Right? You can do that, and you're supposed to actually get the parents' permission before you do that, but it's to keep them safe. It's not to change their parentage and change their nationality. Right? This is a violation of the Rome Statute of the ICC, the International Criminal Court, and it's also a violation of the additional protocols to the Geneva Convention. So So these arrest warrants have come down. It's an interesting sight. You might be thinking, well, is Vlad going to get arrested? It's like, well, he's probably not probably not going to travel to a place where he might be subject to arrest, where maybe he's probably not going to Western Europe anytime soon. There is a legal issue that is contentious about whether you're under customary international law, you can arrest a sitting head of state. So there's that issue too. I think the hope is here that if at some point, it's really the only hope for prosecution, if he's deposed at some point, he could be arrested and put on trial. There also might be other charges coming. It's just the transport of these children and the legal machinations of making them Russian citizens might have been so open that there's a fair amount of evidence with regard to this. Other evidence with regard to things like war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide. Sometimes it takes a lot of investigation. So people shouldn't be disappointed, like, well, all this thing's been going on over there for a year. All we have is this one indictment. Ukraine has been described as a crime scene, where all the investigators from the OSCE, Western European countries, and other international bodies trying to sort out what's happening. I'm going to touch briefly on some of the other allegations that are going on. I don't want to make it all about the Russia-Ukraine war for a couple reasons. And one of them is, and as I'm going to talk about a case that grew out of the Bosnian Civil War, there's the allegations, and then there's what you can actually prove based on the evidence, right? And sometimes the evidence is not what you actually thought it was. Sometimes there are, let me say this, I have no doubt that there are war crimes being committed by the Ukraine, by the Russians in Ukraine. But it's a touchy thing when you have a huge conflict to say that, oh, there's only one side that's ever going to do anything that's going to be violative of the laws of war. Right? That's a tough thing. One of the last times I came and talked about, a gentleman came up to me, and I think I was talking about war crimes tribunals, and he said, with regard to the U.S. military, well, we don't have war crimes tribunals. I said, well, we do. We just don't call them that. You're trying a soldier who murdered a civilian or murdered a prisoner. It's like we don't say this court martial is a war crime trial. It's just an informal name, but it's applied to it. It essentially is a war crime tribunal with regard to that particular soldier. So, this slide and this slide are all the different allegations of what's going on in, or has been going on in the Ukraine. I'm going to talk about just the first one, but you can see from the list there a laundry list of terrible and illegal activity. By the way, have you ever? I'm fascinated by maps, and one of the things I found somebody once said that war is God's way to teach Americans geography. You see these maps sometimes. If you see a map of Ukraine superimposed over the United States, it's almost all of the eastern United States. It's a huge country. And where the fighting's going on would be like going all the way from Detroit over to New York to down the Mid-Atlantic down to the Carolinas. It's a massive front. Right? So we kind of have a tendency to think, well, it's another European country. Ukraine is the largest country in Europe, not counting the European part of Russia. 55 million Ukrainians. That included the several million that have left. So I want to talk about just the first one, indiscriminate attacks and attacks against civilian targets, right? Just as kind of an intro into war crimes. So an indiscriminate attack, right? You're fighting, you're supposed to be targeting other combatants, right? An indiscriminate attack is you don't care. You're not really doing any kind of targeting at all. You're just blasting and you don't care. Either you're not following rules of engagement or your commanders haven't even given you rules of engagement on who to attack and when, who to target and when. So you might not be distinguishing civilian from military. You might actually be targeting civilians on purpose. You might be using cluster munitions, and both sides, Ukraine and Russia, have cluster munitions, but you might be using them in populated areas. And a cluster munition is usually something that's supposed to be used against troops who are in an open area, right? You might be using cluster munition that actually has a high failure rate, so it doesn't go off. This has been a problem in the U.S. arsenal. You're using a cluster munition in a supposedly a proper fashion, and it turns out this happened in Afghanistan. There was a failure rate, and so then the next day, after the weapon was used properly, ostensibly, there were little Afghan kids coming out and they're picking up, oh, what's this yellow thing? Right? It's an unexploded cluster bomb. Right? And so that's one of the problems of cluster munition being an indiscriminate weapon. If it has too high failure rate, it becomes an indiscriminate weapon. Same thing with landmines. If you're using, there's nothing about a landmine in and of itself that's unlawful. The law of land warfare says if you're going to put landmines down, you can put them down to shape a battlefield or defensive posture. You're supposed to make a map of where you put them down, because then you can go dig them up later. Well, that's been a problem. When I was in Bosnia, everybody you had to go over, as part of your check-in, you had to go get a lecture from he was an Irish sergeant major. He was from Ulster, so he had this thick Ulster accent. And they have the minefield maps, because Bosnia is the most heavily mined place on earth. Because the fighting during the Bosnian Civil War, there were 2 sides and 3 sides. At one point, there were 4 sides fighting. A UN commissioner said, if you think you know what's going on in the Bosnian Civil War, you're not paying attention. So mines all over the place. No one's digging them up after the fact. No one's doing the proper map making. And as a matter of fact, I was walking around the base one day, and the big news was under the chaplain's hut, a mine had been discovered. Now, this was in a former Yugoslav air base that the mine, the sappers had been all over it together. Well, some of these things were buried so deep, and then the frost that pushed them up, right? So I made sure after that day I walked on the sidewalks wherever I went, didn't cut across the grass at all. But so this sergeant major from Ulster, all the newbies are there, and he says, "You think you know where all the mines are because you got a map. You don't. You die." So he kind of put the he put the awareness in you. So the great thing, I've never been in such a beautiful place and not be able to go out walking. It's a beautiful country. You just can't go walking around. They were still in the gullies and things. The rains would still wash the mines down, and every now and then, when I was there in an S4 Jeep that hit a mine, it was in the middle of the road. How to get there? It washed down. You didn't see it. By the way, the mines, a lot of times they were mines that the various combatant groups, mostly I think the Bosnians were mostly, bringing them across the mountains. They were plastic. They're from China. You couldn't detect them using metal detectors. So extremely difficult. Does anybody remember I think it's 1980 went around this, or was it 84? The one that was in Sarajevo. I can't remember which was in Sarajevo, but there was all this tremendous ski jumps and everything on the mountain outside of Sarajevo. I apologize for not remembering. I was a little nipper. I don't quite remember all the year of that, but I remember watching it. That mountain is all mined. Cluster munitions. Okay. So you probably remember the Russian attack on the nuclear power plant, Zaporizhzhia, the power plant. Now that's potentially very dangerous. There's a prohibition against attacking something that contains dangerous forces. Right? A dam, for instance, holding back water. You can't attack that. A nuclear power plant. Right? You can't attack it. And the U.S. Embassy in Kiev was quick to label what the Russians were doing a war crime. Both the Pentagon and the DoD kind of walked it back. The Pentagon and the Department of State walked it back because the Russians didn't actually target any of the buildings where there were dangerous forces, and they wanted to make sure that there was the correct distinctions were being made. Still, it's a dangerous situation. The other things that are going on, using of explosives with wide range effects, right? Maybe not smart bombs, but dumb bombs, in areas that are in close proximity to historical monuments, works of art, churches, cultural property. Cultural property has a special protection under international humanitarian law. There's a Hague Convention for the protection of cultural property. Both Russia and the Ukraine are signatories, and they're bound by it. And it prohibits state parties from targeting historic monuments in support of a military effort, or from making them objects of attack. There have been, as of late last year, about 700 attacks on Ukrainian healthcare facilities by Russian forces, including somewhere north of 140 different facilities that were completely destroyed. The UK Ministry of Defense has specifically pointed out that Russia seems to be prioritizing attacks on Ukrainian medical facilities. So that would be something I would expect to see once the evidence is brought forward and the people responsible are identified. That might be something that the ICC would be taking action on as well. By the way, one of the things about the ICC is it's meant to be something of a trial court of last resort. The idea is it's complementary to what nations are going to do. Right? And so what that would mean is a nation would police its own forces first and put them on trial. Or even though Ukraine is not a member of the Rome Statute, the ICC, it actually has invited the ICC, invited jurisdiction to anything going on in the territory of Ukraine. So the ICC is involved in that regard and doesn't need to have the acquiescence, any further acquiescence with regard to it. Obviously, though, it'd be difficult to do a prosecution against Russians who are in Russia and being protected by the state. The idea is if a nation state is unable or unwilling to prosecute, then the ICC would prosecute. Power grid. This is kind of my last point about what's going on. You've seen a lot about the Ukrainian power grid. Something like 40% of the Ukrainian power grid has been targeted. This is a tricky one because if the motivation is, well, we're going to kind of demoralize the Ukrainian people, we're going to try to make them freeze in the wintertime, that's arguably illegal. The problem is, and there's a point of disagreement on the experts on this. The president of the European Commission has said that, and apparently the 11 members of NATO who are over on the eastern part of the continent have said that that's a war crime to target the Ukrainian power infrastructure. There are some other scholars, including a former Air Force Deputy Judge Advocate General, who said that's a power grid is dual use, right? The Ukrainian military is using it just like the civilians are. An easy example is a bridge. That in the daytime there might be civilians going across, in the nighttime troop trains are going across it, right? And so whether something is targetable, it becomes targetable if it is a true dual use, and then you just have to figure out, is the military advantage that you're going to get from targeting it, does it outweigh the impact, the negative impact on the civilian population? I think one can make the argument that power grid does. The U.S. has a specific policy on this where it talks about on dual use targeting. You can target something that impacts and it's a controversial one, impacts the opponent's war fighting or war sustaining capability. Or almost anything can be war sustaining when you think about it. So that's a problematic phrase. We're a lot of our allies. They say, we understand about dual use targeting, but war sustaining is a little bit too broad. So I want to step back a little bit in time. Okay, so I took this 20 years ago, flying in a Slovenian Huey helicopter over Bosnia when I was with S4. And it's beautiful. I appreciate it anytime I could go up because I could see Bosnia because I don't walk in it. It looks nice from that height, but then when you move down a little bit, this is what you see over an enormous part of the country. Those houses are they're empty. They've been, the roofs have been destroyed. A lot of times they were burned out. Miles and miles and miles sometimes of empty houses because the people were driven off and they weren't moving back because of ethnic cleansing. So the Bosnian Civil War, part of the breakup of Yugoslavia, there was 2 million people displaced, 1 million of whom became refugees and left the country, 200,000 dead, 500,000 homes destroyed. So a very common sight. This is kind of the map, the face of ethnic cleansing. Look at, I don't know if I have a pointer. I don't want to risk it. But you see Mostar down in the, let me see if I do have a pointer. Is this a pointer? Hey, it is. There's Mostar. Okay. Mostar is was a very cosmopolitan part of, it wasn't cosmopolitan in the sense of New York. It was cosmopolitan in the sense of Croats, Bosnian Muslims, Bosnian Serbs all lived there. There was a famous bridge built by the Turks during Turkish occupation. Very interesting area. Well, and so that's, if you look at the 1991 map, that's pre-ethnic cleansing, pre-Civil War in Bosnia. And then you can see what happens by 1997, okay? The groups are now dispersed. They were divided by the Dayton Accord line, the Dayton peace talks, which basically was the firing lines, the front lines, when the fighting ceased. So one of the things that we did in the office of legal advisor in Sarajevo was look for PIFWICs. What's a PIFWIC? Someone told me about PIFWICs. I was like, is that like a local bar or something? Like going to Cheers, you're gonna go to PIFWICs? A PIFWIC is a person indicted for war crimes, right? Now this is war crime using the umbrella term because in the Bosnian Civil War, there were people who have been indicted for genocide, crimes against humanity, and regular garden variety war crimes, right? Nothing on the crime of aggression, which I'm gonna get to in a minute. These are, the big enchilada, Slobodan Milosevic, isn't on this slide. He was ultimately indicted because the Serbian government ultimately turned him over, and he was arrested, but he died while the trial was going on. The International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, the ICTY. So he died before the trial was even over. But it was sometimes very difficult to try to get the PIFWICs. Where are they? Right? The fellow on the right, that's Ratko Mladic. He was a Bosnian Serb military leader. And the other guy is Radovan Karadzic. He's there in his statesman mode. He was actually a big, he founded the Bosnian Serb Green Party, environmentalists, and it turns out that really didn't take out. So he was looking for some other vehicle, and ardent nationalism is what he switched to. So the one summer night in 2003, the word came out that we thought we had the number 3 PIFWIC, the number 3 then at large, General Grutovna, who was a Croatian general. Right? So all the lawyers had to go in at the legal at Camp Butnir, we're in the legal office trying to figure out, okay, this is a big deal if you capture a PIFWIC, especially number 3, and General Grutovna was famously on the run. And then there was kind of the people were looking around, it's like, okay, who's going to get to go when they arrested him, and who gets to go on the plane up to The Hague? And there's all kinds of precautions you have to take, by the way. You had to wear a flight suit that had no names, no ranks, no nothing, because you didn't want the PIFWIC to know who you were, because the PIFWIC is going to be able to talk to his lawyers, and your family back in the States might get a visit from Croatian nationalists, Serb nationalists, Bosnian Muslim nationalists. You never know, and so the idea is no one's no identifications. So I was a mere Navy lieutenant commander, not only that, a reservist who was there temporarily, so I wasn't really in the running too bad. I wanted to go up to The Hague. It turns out it wasn't General Grutovna. It was somebody else hiding in a monastery, because the idea was he was supposedly hiding in a monastery, and this was maybe down in Montenegro. They maybe identified. Well, it wasn't him. So what did General Gotovina do? Well, he was indicted by the ICTY, the former Yugoslavia Criminal Tribunal up in The Hague, for the murder of Krajina Serbs. That's a part of Croatia where Serbs lived in a military operation called Operation Storm. Basically, it was ethnic cleansing, or at least the charge was ethnic cleansing, because the operation led to the displacement of approximately 130,000 Croatian Serbs. Now, there was a dispute about that because the U.S. ambassador to Croatia at the time said the Serbs, maybe for good reason, had already left, but they weren't driven out, right? So that became a point of contention in the trial. Did he run them out, or were General Gotovina's troops run them out, or had they already left? So he was, but he was indicted, and somewhere in the neighborhood of about 150 Serbs were said to actually have been murdered, though. The indictment charged that Gotovina's troops, they were shooting civilians, they engaged in arson, they stabbed Serb civilians to death, they destroyed countless buildings in an effort to make it impossible for the Krajina Serbs to go home, whether they had actually already vacated the region or not. So the indictments were really controversial because Croatia he had been caught in the Canary Islands in Tenerife. Turns out he wasn't in Montenegro in a monastery, he was on the beach in Tenerife. But it was controversial among the nationalists, and you see this across the board, and this is the touchy thing we're dealing with the ICC, because in the current day, but into the ICTY, because the Croatian government was cooperating with the tribunal. Well, a lot of people in the Croatian government didn't like that. Ministers were resigning because the Croatian government was working with The Hague on the prosecution of General Gotovina. And a lot of times it's kind of a quid pro quo. You want to get engaged more fully in Europe, you maybe want to join the European Union, you better play ball with us over these pifwits that are hiding, right? So General Gotovina was caught in 2005 and 2011. He was found guilty of 8 of 9 counts on the indictment, sentenced to 24 years of imprisonment. And then in 2012, it went up to the appeals chamber and he was acquitted. because 2 of the 3 judges said they did not have sufficient evidence for the conviction, right? It's a little bit different than the U.S. system. If they had a problem, the Supreme Court doesn't pronounce somebody innocent. They would remand it if there was a procedural problem, but not with the criminal tribunal here. So he was found not guilty, 3 votes to 2. The Serbs were not happy. Obviously, General Gotovina was a Croatian, right? And he had targeted Bosnian Serbs or Croatian Serbs, and so the Serbian government is mad. Serbia is a client state of the Russians. The Russians are mad. So that's from at the time. So a little bit on the law here. So when we're talking about things like war crimes, that kind of hits at a very visceral level. You think, well, and the idea is there's a concept in international law called the jus cogens. Sometimes it's referred to as peremptory norms. I think a good translation is compulsory law or compelling law. Right? These are really important things that you just can't ignore. A nation state doesn't get to ignore these. Now, they don't just arise in a war fighting context. One of the peremptory norms is the illegality of slavery and the slave trade. All nations are actually supposed to be involved in ending slave trade when it's encountered. Another one is piracy. Okay? There isn't any nation state that's going to tolerate piracy and have the other nation states say, well, that's just what you do. No, piracy is it's a hard no, right? Well, when it comes in this context, the law of armed conflict context, we have, I think we could talk, the first example there are, I guess you could talk about the umbrella term, aggression or aggressive warfare, genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. And the second is things that are really integral to the law of armed conflict. Distinction. distinguishing between combatants and non-combatants. Necessity. If you're doing something, there better be a military purpose behind it, not just wanton destruction. Unnecessary suffering. You don't get to do things just to visit unnecessary suffering upon the enemy, using glass bullets, for instance, right? Will be a problem with a glass bullet or something that doesn't show up on an X-ray, just causes suffering, right? Proportionality. You're doing something that is, you're causing a lot of damage, but it's outweighed by the negative impact on the civilian population. So those are 4 core concepts to law of armed conflict. Just a quick thing of what's an example of proportionality. So early in the Iraq War, there were reports of the U.S. dropped a very, very, very large bomb right in the center of Baghdad. Right? It's not a bomb you would be using in the center of Baghdad. There's too many civilians around there. Why in the world did you do that? Well, they thought they knew where Saddam Hussein was. Right? So that's a huge benefit militarily if the person in charge of the enemy forces is eradicated, then it capitulate, that you decapitated the enemy forces, maybe the war ends or whatever. Well, it turns out they were wrong. And if you did that purposefully, you're dropping these bombs all over the place. That's a war crime. You're just using these weapons, and if they're disproportionate impact on the civilian population, you're getting no military benefit from this. The argument here is, well, they thought they were going to get a military benefit, and they were mistaken. Here's another, this is an example I use in class a lot. If you have a sentry post that's outside city, you can target that sentry post, but you better do it in a way that you're not going to impact any civilians, right? Because the sentry is there the city's defended, but you can't drop a 500-pound bomb on that sentry, right? Because there's civilians all around. So, you're going to get, is there a military advantage for taking out a single, enemy sentry? Maybe. But depending on how you do it, you can fall foul of the law of armed conflict and potentially commit a war crime. So, the ICC is not the only context in which the International Criminal Court is not the only context in which to talk about this, but it's very useful just for the purposes of our discussion here today to run through things about the crime of genocide, crimes against humanity. I'm going to come back to war crimes specifically, and then the crime of aggression. So we've had the ICC since 2002. The U.S. is not a party, neither are China, Russia, a lot of other nation states. But it's still useful to talk about the ICC, and because it's playing a role, as we saw with the arrest warrant against Putin. And also the Rome Statute is a really great, the Rome Statute it's not really a statute, it's a treaty that nations got together to form the ICC. And not only are they forming the ICC, they're talking about, well, what can they prosecute and what are the elements of these offenses? I'm not going to run through all of it because I want to leave some time for questions, but so the first one is genocide. Genocide is you have to show intent. And as you can see there, your intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group, right? And you can see the different ways you can commit genocide. I think the reading points out that genocide is something that might be a little bit, because the intent element has to be shown, it can be a little bit more difficult to prove than this, crimes against humanity, which just has to be widespread and systemic against the civilian population. And it's a longer list than for genocide, murder, extermination, enslavement, etc. The list actually continues there, including a catch-all, other inhumane acts of a similar character. So in Bosnia, we had people that were, or the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, both people were found guilty of both genocide and crimes against humanity, in addition to war crimes. This next one is interesting, the crime of aggression. Right? This is difficult. It was originally part of the Rome Statute and the ICC jurisdiction, but there wasn't any definition of it because no one could agree. Well, how are you going to define aggressive war? Right? Finally, in Kampala in 2010, there was another conference. They came up with a proposed definition, and enough nations ratified that the subsequent protocol that it is now enacted for ICC jurisdiction. It'd be very interesting to see if we can get crimes of aggression prosecutions. It really is the most recent attempt to do what the international community did back in 1928 with the Kellogg-Briand Pact, outlawing war, right? Disavowing war as a means of national policy. And the focus here is not the people who might be fighting an illegal war or an aggressive war, but the leadership, the people who planned it, prepared it, initiated it, and executed it. And by the way, some people would say, this is actually a good question. People would say, well, if you have an illegal war, does that mean, what happens then? How does that war have to be fought? Well, first of all, nobody actually thinks there might be a judgment later at the fact that they're always going to have justification, well, this was a lawful war. But if it's not, in the views of a lot of people, myself included, I think that the Russian war against the Ukrainians is an illegal, aggressive war. It's my view. Does that mean that the Ukrainians don't have to fight in accordance with the laws of war because they're being visited? No, they have to, right? And the Russians, even though they're, in my view, engaged in an illegal war, they still are bound by fight in the lawful manner, right? So the character of the war as legal or illegal doesn't matter. The soldiers on the ground and the commanders are supposed to fight it lawfully. And by the way, one last point here about, did I go to sleep? No?
Hold on, it seems to be coming back. There we go.
Fast there. There's the Piflix. Okay. Okay. So the interesting point here, the ICC can only prosecute a war of aggression if either the aggressing state has actually accepted ICC jurisdiction. So that would only be in the case of Russia. Putin's been toppled and it's invited in the ICC. Or there's a referral from the Security Council, the UN Security Council, which isn't going to happen because why? Russia and China are on the UN Security Council, right? So they're going to veto any proposal. Right? That's one of the problems with that. In smaller aggressive war, maybe you can get prosecuted as long as nobody is best buds with somebody on the Security Council. Right? Otherwise, it can be a very thorny thing. So I just wanted to touch on, because I want to leave time for some questions. This is the part of the Rome Statute that deals with war crimes, strictly speaking. I've already alluded to these earlier. The Rome Statute opens when it comes to war crimes. We're talking about things as grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions. Those are things a grave breach of the Geneva Conventions are things that are set out in the third and fourth Geneva Conventions. The third Geneva Convention deals with treatment of POWs. The fourth one is protection of civilians. And you can see the list there. And this is if you're doing any of these things against POWs or civilians, that's a grave breach. And that grave breach is the term of art because if you're a signatory to the Geneva Conventions, you have an obligation to actually hunt down or investigate grave breaches. Right? It isn't something your obligations under the Geneva Conventions is to help investigate and bring to justice people who have committed grave breaches. So that's the first part of the war crimes roster. And I just highlighted some other ones I want to talk to because there are a lot of them. These are, so they moved on from grave breaches, other serious violations of the laws and customs of warfare. Intentionally directing attacks against civilian population, we talked about that, or individual civilians not taking part in hostilities, right? Now, what if a civilian is engaging in hostilities? Do they retain their inviolate status? No, they can't. They can be targeted. See, one of the obligations a civilian has, if you want to have your protected status, is you don't get to fight, right? And what the international lawyers and the military is called, they use the phrase civilian DPH, a civilian directly participating in hostilities, and they can be targeted, right? So So you can target civilians in wartime, but they have to be DPH. Next one, intentionally directing attacks against civilian objects. Right? It's just, most things you're going to see are civilian objects. Like right now, the Kobe is a civilian object. It's a museum. Once upon a time, it was not a civilian object. It was a military objective. So the vast majority of things you're going to see as you go through, those are civilian objects. They can work, a change can get worked and then become a thing under the law as military objectives if the military is using them in a defensive or offensive way. So, for instance, if a house is being used by the enemy as a defensive position, that house can now be attacked. Well, it's a civilian object. Yeah, it's become a military objective because of its use. Right? So it's not a broad brush that civilian objects can't be attacked. They can if they become military objectives. Intentionally launching this is the example of proportionality, an attack on something that's clearly excessive in relation to the concrete and direct overall military advantage. Defending undefended objects that are not military objectives. Some of it's a little bit repetitious, but it's making clear about what war crimes are. And of course, the Rome Statute is not the only place where these are laid out. Laid out in other treaties and conventions. There's an additional protocol to the Geneva Conventions that lays out a lot of these. It's also well represented in customary international law. A lot of the commentary of the International Committee for the Red Cross. But as I say, the Rome Statute is a good place to focus and learn about it. If you kill or wound somebody who is a combatant who's laid down their arms, there's a French phrase, it's called hors de combat. They are no longer in combat, right? You cannot, harm them, attack them, wound them. You have to leave them alone. Making improper use of a flag of truce. That's a white flag. It doesn't necessarily mean surrender. It means I want to talk. It might mean surrender. What if you are approaching an enemy force and you're waving a white flag, so they put their guns down, and then you pull out a gun and you shoot the people coming out to talk to you? That's called perfidious conduct. It's perfidy. It's a war crime. You've used a flag of truce in an unlawful fashion. Using distinctive emblems of the Geneva Conventions. There was I don't know how famous it was, but the British forces wanted to, I think, arrest a suspected insurgent who was in an Iraqi hospital. Problem was, they couldn't bring their arms into the hospital where this insurgent was. So somebody got the bright idea they were just going to put their sidearms in a Red Cross bag, right? They got in a lot of trouble because that's an illegal use of a protected symbol. So, and that's a small area as opposed to running ammunition to the front on an ambulance, right? You're not supposed to target that ambulance because it's got a big Red Cross on it. It's like the hospital ship, right? Well, it's going back to the front anyways. Why can't we just put ammunition and weapons in it? Well, you better cover up the Red Cross then because it's a protected symbol. And you don't want the respect that the enemy gives to the protected symbol to wane because there's abuse. And you don't want the system to start to break down. As we see, there's number 8 there, occupying power, moving the civilian population to the territory it occupies, or deportation or transfer of all or parts of the population by Putin. Directing against not just historic monuments, but religion, educational, art, science, charitable buildings that are not military objectives. Killing or wounding treacherously, that's another example. Think of the white flag example I just used, the feigned surrender. Declaring that no quarter will be given. Anybody ever heard that phrase? No quarter? You ever seen Lawrence of Arabia? Remember that great, towards the end, and he attacks a Turkish column that's fleeing, right? With some of his the Arab army. And the reason it is a problem is not that he's attacking a retreating Turkish column. He can do that, but he yells, "No prisoners!" Right? That's no quarter. And then actually later on in the scene, you have some Turkish soldiers who are putting their arms up and they're just getting run down. Right? So that's an illegal order to tell your troops no quarter. Don't take prisoners, because you're essentially saying, "I don't want prisoners. right? If someone tries to surrender, you have an obligation as a fighting force. If people are trying to surrender, you have to take their surrender. Here's another another point about the destruction of the enemy's property, unless it be imperatively demanded by the necessities of war. I want to mention something else. There's an obscure bit of World War II history called the Finland. There's a war in Lapland between the Nazis and the Finns. Now, at one point earlier in the war, the Germans are helping the Finns fight the Germans, right? And then at some point that breaks down. The Germans are losing, and they're not getting out of the country fast enough for the Finns, and so they start fighting. And there was he's an Austrian, but he's a Wehrmacht commander. His name is Lothar Renilak. And Lothar Renilak in Lapland, the Lapland part of Finland, destroys a bunch of buildings. Right? And among other things, he's charged with that as a war crimes tribunal after the war. It's called the scorching of Lapland. Now, his defense was, I wasn't doing, it turned out, and the ally argument was, he didn't need to do that. There was no military necessity that ultimately turned out to be an aid of. His defense was, I know that, but at the time, this is what I was told. This was why I did it, right? It turned out to be incorrect intelligence of why he did it. But he said, I was sincere in doing it based on what I understood at the time. And so the Renilak rule is, it's not really a strict liability thing. Hey, you can't show me right now, after the fact, your military necessity for having destroyed that. The Renilak rule says, tell me what you were thinking at the time. And if you can articulate at the time why you did it, even if ultimately you didn't need to have done it in retrospect, you're going to have a defense to that, to an allegation that you have you committed an act that was disproportionate in relation to the military necessity. Down below, using poison weapons, that's an old one that goes back many centuries. Employing asphyxiating, poisonous, or other gases or other analogous weapons. There, interesting point there, the U.S. Will use tear gas. The U.S. says we don't use tear gas as a method and means of warfare. We will use tear gas to go out and, for instance, lay down a bunch of tear gas if we're going to try to rescue a pilot. Other nations say that's warfare. You're actually using tear gas to suppress people who are trying to get your pilot, and you don't want to go in there and get them first. The U.S. response is, well, we're not using it in an offensive operation where it's defensive, and so it would be okay if we went in and basically killed everybody sneaking up on our pilot. We just want to use tear gas. And the answer is, well, yeah, you could kill them, but you can't use tear gas. Right? So the U.S. actually it's controversial though, because there are some forces that are very, especially the European forces and the Canadian allies, they're like, nope, we don't give troops tear gas. The U.S. has always said, well, we will use it under certain circumstances, not on the battlefield. We'll use it against rioting POWs if we have to. We're not going to shoot them. We're going to use tear gas. But I don't think the French army will do it. They'll fill Paris full of tear gas, but I don't think the French army will use tear gas after their experience in World War I. So you kind of get the idea of war crimes per se. They're more battlefield-oriented things. So obviously, here, sexual violence is a big one. Utilizing presence of civilians and other protected persons to render certain points, areas, or military forces immune from military operations. That's a long way of saying what? You don't get to use human shields. You don't get to bring them in and park them there. That's a war crime. Already talked about the distinctive emblems. Starving civilians or getting in the way of relief supplies, child soldiers, 15 and over are okay, but not under 15. And my last few slides, I'm just going to go, I'm not even going to spend a lot of time on it, because basically what it does is it takes, there are parts of the Rome statutes that's making clear that in the case of an armed conflict, not of international character, because you could have a situation as a large scale, there is a war going on, maybe it's a civil war, but it's a broad enough use of force that the Rome statute wants to make clear, you don't get to say, well, yeah, we shot those prisoners, but it wasn't a war because it's not an international armed conflict. You can't tell me that international law was in operation. So why can't I shoot Christians? They were, my countrymen. I get to do that. This is an internal matter. The Rome Statute is saying if you have an armed conflict not of international character, it's a non-international armed conflict. The experts use the phrase NIAC. There are some things you cannot do, and you can see the list there of the things you can't do. And it doesn't mean that it's not just an internal disturbance or a riot or anything like this, but something that's large-scale armed conflict. There will be a debate about, well, how big does something have to be before it's like a NIAC? Does it a non-international armed conflict? Does it have to be the Spanish Civil War? With one side purporting to have a government and controlling territory and the other side also doing the same. Maybe it doesn't have to be the Spanish Civil War. It could be smaller than that. But maybe not just fighting a small group of narco terrorists in the jungle. But you don't get, the point is you don't get to say, we're dealing with a rebellion here, and so we're going to put it down. The Rome Statute is saying there are some things you can't do. And so the marker was just put down there with regard to that. And the list of things you can't do they're the predictable list. A lot of them are the same as exist on the international armed conflict rules. So that was 1 hour and 5 minutes, and so I went over to 1 hour 3 minutes. I was a little bit over, and so I'm happy to answer any questions.
That wasn't a hard and fast rule, by the way, but thank you for honoring the hour. If anyone has questions, comments, please put their hands up, and Linda will get to you in the room. If you have questions or comments online, just type them into the comments box on either Facebook or YouTube, and I will get them into the room that way. So let's get started.
How can we justify dropping bombs on civilians in Japan?
Yeah, that not only was the firebombing especially of Tokyo and some of the other cities was controversial at the time, and then the nuclear bombing of the two cities, there were a lot of people in the military that were against it. The head of the Navy, Fleet Admiral King, who wasn't a softie. Somebody once said about Admiral King, he is the most even-tempered man in the Navy. Mad all the time. He was very much against it. I think they determined that there's one of the things about the war in the East, and I don't want to defend it. And it's not just Japan. I mean, the things that went on in the European cities. There was the person in charge of Bomber Command for the British, Bomber Harris. He was the only major commander in. The only major commander among the British who was not given a peerage. There was a lot of unsettling feeling about like turning Hamburg into a lake of fire overnight and killing 20,000 people. The justification was, well, we have to break the will of the German people to fight so they can depose Hitler. They're not about to depose Hitler. They have no way of deposing Hitler, right? So, obviously you take a look at Dresden, Yokohama, Tokyo. The law has totally developed with regard to area bombing civilian targets. The idea that you're going to break the will of the civilian population by killing tens and thousands of them doesn't make a lot of sense. It's good that we're having conversations about, okay, the power supply, 40% of the Ukrainian power supply is being targeted. What impact is that having on the civilians? Those were conversations that weren't happening before. The law does develop on it. The law of aerial warfare wasn't fully developed before World War II. There was law of naval warfare against naval ships bombarding undefended cities. There wasn't anything about aerial warfare. And one could say, well, that's a bit of a technicality. Well, maybe it was, because there were a lot of people familiar enough with the law as it existed, and sort of extrapolating upon that, we shouldn't be doing these to the cities. Now, I guess in response, if you've ever been to the World War II Museum in New Orleans, it's fascinating because there's at least one wall that's all about the U.S. plans for the invasion of Japan, and how long it was going to take and how many troops it was going to take. You know, some of these projections were it was going to be 1946, 1947, and quite apart from the U.S. forces that were going to perish, incredible amounts of Japanese civilians who were being prepared to fight, notwithstanding their civilian status. I don't think, all I can say in short answer to your question, if it was going on right now, that hopefully would not be the same decision getting made. There are some things about the laws that existed at the time that there was a breakdown in the Far East that didn't necessarily break down in the European theater. I'll give you one example. There was basically unrestricted submarine warfare going on in the Pacific. There wasn't any, with any regard to U.S. submarines that were going to attack merchant ships, Japanese merchant ships, naval ships. There wasn't any, let me go back to hospital ships. There's a convention in hospital ships. They're protected. They're painted white. Then there were a lot of hospital ships in World War II. The Army had most of the hospital ships. They were painted white, they had a big red cross on them or whatever. One of your obligations under the law of hospital ships is if the enemy approaches you, you have to pull over. You have to heave to and let them come on board and make sure that you're not taking contraband. I had a client once when I was practicing law, and he was a young sergeant on an Army hospital ship in the English Channel. This was after D-Day. And I'd say, well, tell me about that. It's like, oh, it was really interesting dealing with the Germans. I said, what do you mean dealing with Germans? Oh, yeah, we had Germans would board us all the time. They jump on board, they had their submachine guns, and they're just going through the U.S. Army hospital ship. It's an example of interbelligerent relations, right? Where belligerents have to deal with each other sometimes. You know, they're exchanging prisoners or they're inspecting hospital ships. So they go through and then they say, yeah, okay, you're good. And then they hop on their patrol boat and then they leave, right? None of that was going on in the Pacific. It basically had, all the systems had broken down. So.
I wonder if you could discuss the war crimes that were committed in Syria, and is that would be internal, and is anyone looking at that?
Yeah, which time frame are you talking about?
Well, the most recent one, you know, was so much civilian bombing and the gas and everything that happened.
Yeah. Well, my understanding is it's getting looked at. I mean, it's a very difficult situation there with the Assad regime and the different, the Turks, the Russians, the West. I don't know. I have read a lot about the gas attacks, and you have experts saying totally different things about it. It seems to me that there were gas attacks, and all I can say is if those are confirmed and using gas against basically your own civilian population. First of all, that's one of the things the Saddam Hussein was hung for. To not do it, to not take any action is a very dangerous precedent. And that's one of the things we said at the time. It's like, well, that's a red line. Don't do that. Don't cross it. If you're going to say something like that, it doesn't help if then the red line's crossed and we don't take action. So I think it is getting looked at, but there hasn't been any proposal I know of that has put forward an ad hoc tribunal for Syria, and I don't know if there are any indictments. I don't think there are any indictments that the ICC has come down with so far.
So do you think that these rules, just existing, sort of declare what's humane and what's non-humane, do you think over this, since the first Geneva Conventions in the late 19th century, that they've had any kind of positive impact at all in terms of how war is conducted? I mean, it seems to me that war just keeps getting more inhumane all the time. But the hope was, I think, to say, like, come on, we're civilized people now. I mean, at least white people were saying that, I guess, about themselves. And we want to sort of revive the virtue of honor in a sense, and not do evil things. But do you think that do you think war would even be worse without them?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. It would be much worse without them. Yeah. I mean, that's there was Louis Henkin, who's an international legal scholar, who said most nations obey most international law most of the time. And some things are really hot button. I mentioned like the criticism the U.S. gets over something like tear gas, right? I mean, a lot of nations though, they train with regard to the laws of armed conflict very seriously. It doesn't mean outrages don't occur. But the better trained a fighting force is, the fewer the outrages. Is it perfect? No. Although sometimes there are good effects. Now, I'm not saying the European theater compared to the Pacific theater was great. There was a lot of outrages. I think the law of air warfare dictates a totally different campaign if that war was fought now. You do have international actors that, for example, in the Russian war in Chechnya, I mean, they fought that they leveled the town of Grozny. It's like World War II style, right? So there are some actors that don't care, or don't seem to care. And there are some that do, and they imperfectly care about it. So there are, like the United States where a lot of times people had a lot of opinions about, our rules of engagement dealing with insurgents in Baghdad, whatever, it's out of date, it's not effective or whatever. Well, it may not have been the most effective way of doing it, but given how we fight, we're not going to not have rules of engagement. It doesn't work. It breaks down as your fighting force. So then if your answer is you're going to be frustrated with that kind of urban warfare, then don't go there. It isn't pull back, bring out the artillery, and do a Russian Grozny on Baghdad, right? Which we didn't do. But there'll still be outrages. I think, though, it's getting better. There's a lot more awareness. A lot of U.S. allies train very much as U.S. trained. And it is sometimes a foreign concept. When we went in and had the Northern Alliance as allies in Afghanistan, right? The first thing we did is like, we got a bunch of army, we got to get uniforms on these guys, right? So we got uniforms on them, but the way they would fight wasn't all that different from the Taliban. I mean, the idea of using, trying to speak to the enemy and then pulling out a gun, perfidious conduct was not all that uncommon. It is getting better. War is a very, it's obviously a very difficult situation. And this is why, going back to Kellogg Briand, we're going to try to end war as an instrument of national policy. I think it is a little bit, the nature of the Russo-Ukrainian war, though. I mean, it really is, maybe people are waking up because this stuff is not all that uncommon, but it's uncommon in Europe. Bosnia was the biggest thing since 1945. And the fighting going on right now is just dwarfs what was going on in Bosnia. Maybe not from the standpoint of genocide or crimes against humanity so far, hopefully not, but certainly from the widespread nature of the conflict. But it's, it might unfortunately be early days. But I think it's much better if this is in place than if we didn't. My opinion.
Okay, I'm trying to get my thoughts around this here and the main issue, and to follow up on the last question, because it doesn't seem to me as if everybody plays by the rules. As a matter of fact, I wonder if it makes any sense to even talk about international laws and being bound and obligated when there's no international government and nobody to enforce this. And apparently the Russians, from what we're seeing now, don't seem to care about any of these.
Yeah.
And so, doesn't it sort of undercut the whole discussion? I believe that the United States at least talks about all these issues. And then sometimes there's things that probably are against them. And probably other European countries and many other countries in the world too. But as long as Russia and China ignore this stuff, we can indict them, but we can't enforce it. So what's the point?
Right. Well, I mean, you do pay a price if you become an international pariah. I don't know the Chinese government. I don't think 10 years ago would have thrown in with Russia on this type of war. Now, Xi Jinping he's a different character, right? Putin's a different character. Yeltsin certainly would have done this, but so every now and then you got these players that are, they're happy to be leaders of rogue states. Now, China is, I mean, it's in a different situation, a different category than Russia. It's not like Russia's not a gas station with nuclear weapons. I mean, it's a huge trading partner, but it is a very difficult. It's a very difficult thing when major actors will ignore the laws of war. Now we're going to have to see. I mentioned Ukraine being a crime scene. We're going to see the extent of it. I have no doubt when a large state like Russia is on the cusp of getting humiliated, that the word goes forth and the commanders are not taking a lot of care. And indeed, I don't know that that's I don't know if that's a career ender in the Russian military if you were to take too much care. Probably not. Whereas it is a career ender in other militaries. When President Biden was, I think he was a senator, though there were hearings on this once, and the question was well, why? And this is when his son was in the army, and the question is like, why do we follow the Geneva Conventions? Because so many of our, in this case, we're dealing with transnational terrorist groups who don't care about that at all. They have no obligation. They're not even supposed to be fighting under international law. Right? So, and then Senator Biden said, no, we have to do this because, for my son's sake, because it's a quid pro quo. Quid pro quo. With all due respect, that's not the answer, right? We have to fight because that's what the law requires, and that's what a well-trained armed force does. It doesn't mean they're going to do it perfectly, but you have to follow the law. And you can't say, oh, well, we're fighting transnational terrorist groups, so there's no rules. We're going to go to town. And too bad if you're a civilian in that area, or we're not going to take care we're not going to have rules of engagement. We don't want to send a force in that way. I'm not saying we'll do it right all the time, but so that's not the answer, that the rule book is out the door if we don't happen to get somebody on the other side, because that's not the reason that we follow the law. Although it's what a lot of people, I understandably say, well, what's the point of this, right? But it's an imperfect thing. I mean, that's why I think, potentially having somehow a prosecution for an aggressive war. I mean, this is kind of unprecedented to have something this, these two major states in Europe, fighting like this. I mean, it's a kind of an unprecedented. These were not border skirmishes and things. This is, basically aggressive warfare, it is. Every now and then these things happen in history, and the answer is, hopefully, we have things like the ICC, we have other I have no doubt if something happens, there's a change in government in Russia, I think they would set a tribunal.
Well, what if Putin is arrested? Could you make a pretty solid case for war crimes against him?
Well, it depends what the evidence is and what he ordered. I mean, as far as aggressive warfare, you can imagine what he would say.
That's pretty obvious.
It's obvious, but it's obvious to me. But he's going to say, well, we're being encircled. I mean, a few months before, where the West is sending these, talking about interoperability with NATO forces, and they keep pushing us into a box, and then he's going to say, like, I know you don't like this, but you had your Monroe Doctrine. You said don't go here, to the European powers, and I've been saying for years, don't go here with regard to the Ukraine. But that's one thing. It would, I would, I know there are some people. Well, I don't want to express an opinion on that. I was going to talk about negotiations, and I think that would be the best way to end things right now, to get some negotiated settlement going, because right now it's a meat grinder.
There is a question over there.
Are other countries now that are supporting Putin kind of on his side, aren't they now violating international law? Can they be in trouble now too?
No,
They're supporting a war crime person, aren't they then,
No.
secondarily being a war criminal too?
no, you have to engage in the crime of aggressive warfare, or you have to actually use an example, genocide, crimes against humanity, or war crimes on the battlefield. I mean, they could be the ally of Putin. The Chinese may give him some weapons. The Indians are buying his gas. Right? That doesn't mean the Indians are, culpable under the Rome Statute or under international law.
And then is Putin totally safe as long as he stays hunkered down in his own country? No one's gonna do anything about this?
For right
And
now.
what's the ICC, the tribunal, are they like a mix of all different countries?
Yeah, I mean, so there was the president of Sudan, Bashir, while he was, this goes back to can you arrest a head of state? So the indictment came out against the head of state for Sudan, and he actually traveled to some ICC states, and they declined to actually arrest him. Because there's a controversy there with regard to, he's a head of state, right? You've heard diplomatic immunity, this is a head of state there. So you have this, so I don't think Putin's gonna risk it. I don't think he's gonna go to Paris. But it is a debate among international scholars if the head of state is indicted by the ICC, do you have the power of arrest, right? Now, like I mentioned earlier, the idea of Putin getting prosecuted, the best thing is for him, and the ICC would want, is for him to get deposed, and then the Russians put him on trial. Now, maybe that's not going to happen, and he gets deposed and never leaves Russia, or is careful where he goes, and by then he might be facing more than one warrant. There might be a lot more. Probably will be.
I have a question from someone online. Anne was wondering, do any international rules potentially apply to the Israel-Palestinian situation?
Well, yes, I mean, when the Israeli armed forces are engaging, say, with forces in Gaza, I mean, that's, no matter what that conflict is called, I mean, the international law of armed conflict is applicable, including proportionality and targeting. And that goes both ways, right? So sending missiles that aren't directed out of Gaza just somewhere over Israel that's indiscriminate targeting, right? So, but there isn't and just like if the Israelis responded by just blasting Gaza, right? It's controversial enough that they go back and they try to hit where the rockets came from. And the idea is, well, that's a populated area. And the Israelis say, yeah, I know, that was the whole purpose of the Palestinians launching the rockets from a populated area. They shouldn't do that. Yeah, well, that's going to be too easy for you to target them, right? So it's a back and forth thing. But the law is applicable. So there's not a lacuna in the law. And even if you were regarded as a non-international armed conflict, which is maybe what the Israelis would do, I can't speak for them, the Palestinians would certainly say, no, it's an international armed conflict because we're Palestine, we're a nation.
Earlier in the Russian-Ukrainian war, there were reports of Ukrainian citizens actually, for example, using Molotov cocktails against tank battalions and that were incoming. There was retaliation against those citizens with the explanation that since they were using these munitions, they were no longer considered a citizen. They were considered part of the conflict combatant military.
Well, it's interesting, it comes up a lot. It comes, so that, for instance, if the Russian tank is approaching and you're throwing a Molotov cocktail at it, you can be targeted, right? Because you're engaging in hostilities. The question is then, if you go beyond that though, does that mean that the Russians could decide that, if there's any one of a number of Ukrainian civilians that we're just going to identify and hold them as hostage? You can't do that. You can target civilians directly participating in hostilities. And then this goes back to for how long? There's a great debate about this, and it came up in the context of insurgent warfare in Iraq and Afghanistan. Right? Okay, so the person who's planning the IED on a route that U.S. military he's planning the IED. Can you attack him? Yeah, he's a civilian. He's directly participating in hostilities. He's burying a bomb. Okay, can you attack the people while they're making a bomb? The U.S. would say yes. Some people would say no, you can't. They're not actively doing it. And there's a huge debate among the experts, right, about what, you know, and the U.S. approach, maybe I'm being a little bit unfair. The U.S. approach was you can target civilians directly participating in hostilities, and your reference point is a calendar. And the opposing view is no, your reference point is a stopwatch, right? They got to be actively doing it right then, otherwise no. And then the U.S. response to that is like, oh, it's got a revolving door then, right? They got away with it, they're going to go back and they're going to get more bombs and they're going to come out. And if you can do it in the dead of night, hey, you got away with it. And the next morning, even if you know who he is, you can't go arrest him because they're not doing anything right now. You can't target them. And so the U.S. response is that's a nonsense because the whole idea is we want to dissuade civilians from participating in hostilities. That's not what they should be doing as bad as warfare is. We don't want to expand it into people who are civilians, right? If you start to look the other way with regard to civilian DPH, you're not going to get less warfare. You're going to get more. You're going to have an armed civilian cohort out there. And that doesn't breed respect among an armed force with distinctions between fighters and non-fighters, right? So there is one thing under, there is one way that civilians can be lawful, they can fight lawfully and then still retain their protections after they're captured. And that is, it's called a levy en masse. And if you have an invading force, let's say an invading force is invading a country, and the citizens of a particular city take up arms to fight them, right? That's called a levy en masse, right? And you can still engage them because they're fighting you, can fight them. But it means when the fighting's done, instead of being treated as war criminals for having fought, they're POWs, which is it's a strange part of the law. It doesn't happen very often, the levy en masse. But that's one way as civilians, it has to be a collective and a localized area engaging in hostilities. But that's really the only way a civilian can engage in hostilities. And people will say, well, what about like the CIA advisors and things like that? It's like, yeah, it's a civilian DPH. You know, they're not members of the military. And then the response is, yeah, so they can be, if they get captured by an insurgent, too bad for them, but a Marine staff sergeant, too bad for them, because they're not getting, there's not a respect for the combatant status of U.S. forces in certain conflicts, which is true, but that's not a reason to get rid of the law.
Before we get to another question in the room, I do have another question online. Lorraine was wondering, is deliberate targeted killing of a leader of a war machine, and the example she gives is Osama bin Laden, considered a war crime?
Targeting an adversary military leader? Or
Yeah, she referred to it as killing of a leader of a war machine. And the example she gave was Osama bin Laden.
Yeah, I would say killing Osama bin Laden was lawful because you can attack Osama bin Laden's minions. I mean, because we have an authorization to use the military force, so you can do that. And here's another thing that if you have even in the context of like a Western democracy, like the people the civilians who might be in the military chain, I mean, they can be targeted, including including head of state. So because they're technically they're commanding and controlling. I wouldn't say they're civilians directly participating in hostilities, but they're commanding and controlling. So it's not like at what point, if you can attack a clerk typist somewhere just because they happen to be wearing the sergeant stripes, you can actually, can you attack the civilian leadership of the people calling the shots? It's like, well, yeah, you can. A lot of times people throw around the word assassination, and it's like, well, assassination is I guess one definition of it is a political killing. People say, oh, Osama bin Laden was he was assassinated. It's like, oh, that's not really a legal term. He was killed. He was viewed as he's a unlawful enemy combatant. He was fighting. He was in controlling Al Qaeda. There was a legal basis for the U.S. to engage with him, and he didn't have any expectation. Now, could he have surrendered? Yeah, I mean, we don't exactly know what happened in that room. I don't think they were probably working very hard to take a surrender, but he probably made that pretty easy by not trying to surrender. So.
Yes, sir. I'd like to make a comment that one of the sponsoring organizations of this series of lectures is Pax Christi. Pax Christi is an international organization promoting peace throughout the world. And it was a wonderful presentation. Thank you.
We still have time. We still have time. Don't panic. We'll get to everyone who has a question.
My question is about what happened in Crimea. Were the tactics that the Russians used in the conflict that led to the annexation of Crimea similar to what they started doing in the Ukraine? And if that's the case, why didn't anything happen back then that might have forestalled what's happening now?
Yeah, the little green men, the people who were showing up, and they weren't wearing Russian army uniforms. And I mean, Crimea is a tough one. First of all, do you know when Crimea became part of Ukraine? 1953. Why? Khrushchev said it was, right? It's overwhelmingly Russian. At least now it is. Stalin deported a lot of the people who were non-Russians there and brought in Russians, right? But it's overwhelmingly Russian. It's very important in Russian history. Not only were there tremendous battles against the Soviets and the Germans there during World War II, obviously it was a focus of the Crimean War. It's a very important port on the Black Sea for the Russians, right? So it's a I'd love to go back in a time machine and tell Khrushchev to do that. Because he had no idea. They were believing in all this nonsense. Although the age of nations has passed in the Soviet Union, and there is going to be no Russia, no Ukraine. Everyone's just going to join the Soviet Union in a wonderful socialist brotherhood, and there won't be any more of this, You saw what happened in Yugoslavia, the land of the Southern Slavs, and it just blew all apart. So when I was in college, there was a quote in the International Cultural Center, and I think it's a quote from the Jesuit Desjardins, but I can't remember quite. But it says the age of nations is past, and I think the age of nations is not past. And internationalists may believe this, and this is in a building where they're teaching us like 150 different languages and the history of all these countries, and it's like so. I understand the Ukrainian perspective, and the Western perspective is we don't change borders in post-World War II Europe that way. As a matter of fact, I think that's something that Senator Kerry said at the time. This is not like the old West. And I'm watching that and I say, okay, I kind of get that, but what happened in Kosovo again? It's now independent. It's like the most historical part of Serbia. Now, there's not a lot of Serbs that live there. It's mostly Kosovars, right? And the Serbs kind of messed it up to put themselves in that situation where they lost Kosovo. But I'm thinking, okay, that has all the makings of a Balkan War at some point. I think but I guess this is a long way of saying, Crimea is not an example of basically the Russians moving in and kicking out a bunch of Ukrainians. I mean, it was very, very much oriented towards Russia. Now, the Donbass has a lot of Russian sympathizing populations, but that is Ukraine, and historically, has been. It would. This is some of these problems aren't intractable. That's why it would be great if there was, a negotiated settlement. The Ukrainians talk about retaking Crimea, which, if they do, it's like, well, we might be fighting over it again in 100 years. Yeah.
So they're basically not complicated.
Well, the Crimea situation I'm viewed is a little bit different than the Donbass, right? Because the answer is that that is de jure Ukraine. I mean, you could say that the Crimea is as well. I mean, as a technical matter, it the Russians did invade and they've annexed the Crimea, and then they annexed, purportedly to have annexed these other areas. That's why, Putin's going to say, "Oh, I didn't make these children Russian citizens." The plebiscite, the phony plebiscite that I had, made them Russian citizens because everybody voted to become part of Russia. It's like, well, in areas where they're occupied by your troops, they voted. Yeah, and that's, on the other side, it is a dangerous precedent if you have people saying like, well, the Sudeten Germans, they decide they want to be German, so too bad for Czechoslovakia. It's like, that's where the borders are, right? So you want to move to Germany, you move to Germany, because you can start remaking the map. There's always going to be problems on the map.
I was wondering if there was a statute of limitations on war crimes. I was thinking of St. Patrick's Day, and I thought of Ireland, and I think number 8 of the war crimes applied to the British coming into Ireland. And I thought, if it's a long time ago and there are no actual war criminals left, can the country sue for reparations from the country itself that committed, the people of that country committed whatever war crime, even though there are no actual individuals left?
Yeah, I mean, in that case, in the Northern Ireland case, it's going to be a little bit difficult because, the government you're talking about is the Northern Six, and that's part of the UK anyway. So that's the UK government. Now, okay, so if demographics change and that become part of the Republic, is the Irish Republic going to go back and try to sue for reparations? Well, they have to really, they'd have to find the international court that will, hear the claims for reparations.
But isn't that possible? I just want, not necessarily the Ireland case, but any case, I know that people have been pretty unhappy with Turkey.
Oh, yeah, I mean.
Millennia ago, I think.
Yeah. Well, even 100 years ago. Yeah, I mean, it's there has to be a vehicle by which you can ask for reparations. I mean, that's not I don't have a tremendous background in knowing like how you can do that. I mean, the Turks are basically denying that a genocide took place. Obviously, I think you're right to bring up something like reparations as opposed to a trial, because the longer it goes, you're going to have proof issues, and you're going to have reparations are something that are done. I think most commonly in a non-conflict scenario at the end of the conflict, and you can have reparations are set up, but the loser is going to have to pay the winner X, and sometimes that can actually be more problematic, as we saw at the end of World War I. Which didn't help. It didn't help with the peace of Europe after. So.
When a person goes into officer training, I imagine that's part of his training to learn what is acceptable and not acceptable and that. What about the non-officers? Do they learn anything?
Yeah. I mean,
and how do they learn?
Yeah. So, I didn't bring any with me. I have a collection of these little ROE cards, right? So first of all, everyone's giving them lectures and things about it, but let's say you're going in a country, and let's say you're going to Bosnia, you're going to Kosovo or whatever, and it's potentially a hostile situation. A lot of times soldiers are given ROE cards that will give them kind of a little brief there about like, okay, when can you use armed force? What are the circumstances? Now, they've been the ROE cards are interesting. Sometimes they'll even have phonetic spelling of words in the foreign language about saying stop, U.S. soldier or whatever. But they're a little controversial because some people are saying that it's not a good way of training them. People need to know instinctively not to pull up their card and say, wait, can I shoot now or not? But yeah, I mean, rules of engagement, especially in a situation where all forces haven't been declared hostile or whatever. I mean, encountering civilians is something that you'll always, need to train for, right? And even that can break down, as we saw numerous times with Vietnam. You're encountering civilians all the time, and Sometimes you're attacking them without justification, or sometimes they're looking like civilians and they're actually insurgents attacking you. So that it does really start to break down. But all nations are obligated to train under the law of armed conflict, and the U.S. policy is U.S. forces will abide by the international law of armed conflict without regard to how the conflict is characterized, right? Whether somebody says, "Oh, it's not a war." After 9/11, there was all these instant experts on TV, and they were saying, "Oh, well, the laws of war don't apply because no one's declared war." It's like, when's the last time somebody declared war? That's not, that's a legal nonsense. We don't do that. The rules of engagement will sometimes go into a lot more detail about what to do in circumstances. It won't just be a little treatise on the law. They will be reflective of the international law, and they're not written by the JAGs. A lot of times people will say that, "Hey, JAG, get in here and write the rules of engagement." It's like they have to be written for the operators because the operators need to understand. You got to advise them about that's not lawful. This would be lawful. Don't do this until this happens or whatever. But there's training. There's supposed to be appropriate training at every level, including at the highest levels. They'll have the lawyers will go and say, "You can't really do that. You can't target that hospital." Well, there's a machine gun on top of it. Okay, well, maybe you can target it now. Tell me more about it. And it's like, is the machine gun actually being used, or is it just sitting there, or whatever? So sometimes even though you might be able to make a case you can do something, your lawyer's going to advise you not to do it just because you can, or because there's, speaking of now versus then, it's like now there's what sometimes referred to as the CNN factor, right? And the cell phone factor. It's like you got to be aware all the time. Whereas something that might have been a historical footnote if it happened in the 19th century or the 20th century, now there are cell phones everywhere, right? And you need to be aware of that. And that doesn't mean you should not care about what the law is, but that's an extra reason to care about what the law is. So I don't know if that's a helpful answer, but.
And unfortunately, that is all the time we have for questions in order to get everyone. So a huge round of applause for Professor Kelly. There was a lot to unpack in his PowerPoint presentation. If anyone wants a copy of that, call the library and ask for my email address. It's tgidzinski@manitowoc.org, spelled just like it sounds. Thank you for coming this evening. And join us next week for our final topic, which is global famine. So we hope to see you all next week. Have a great night, and thank you for coming. And thank you once again to Professor Kelly.